morning. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehudit. It's just close enough to me. Yehudit. Yehudit in South Carolina, Joe in the Inland Empire, Guy in Ohio, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, Bill in mid-Missouri, Belle in Texas, Shandor in the Bronx. Bill says, today is my 35th birthday. Happy birthday, Bill. Yom Huledet Sameach. May it be your best year yet. And we say Amen. Lorraine in Texas, Sharon in New Jersey, as well as Chaim in Florida, Eve in Florida, DPR NYC in Brooklyn, Frank in San Pedro, Alan in New York City, Ella in Southern California. Our daf today is daf Gimel, page 3, here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. 29th, right? Arias was 28, and now we're in 29. Somebody check my math. Okay. We are at the bottom of page 2b and continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1 of Tractate Zevachim, which is all about bringing offerings in the Holy Temple when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. Very interesting. Okay, let me dismiss that. So we're not talking about which offering you bring for which situation. Is it a sin offering? Is it a guilt offering? Is it a burnt offering? Why you bring it? What atonement you achieve with it? Right now, we're actually talking much more specifically about how offerings were brought in the Holy Temple. And the first question that we're asking is, it's an interesting place to start. So often, right, in the Talmud, we don't go to the basics. When we bring this kind of offering, we slaughter it in this location, but we start with something a little more advanced. What if you made a mistake? And what mistake? You were bringing a sin offering to atone for an unwitting sin that you committed. Maybe you moved something on Shabbos that shouldn't have been moved. You didn't realize it was Shabbos, or you didn't realize that action would violate Shabbos, so it was an unwitting transgression. And so you became obligated to bring a sin offering to make an atonement. You consecrated, let's say a goat to bring for that purpose. You brought it to Jerusalem. You brought it to the Holy Temple. And then the first, step in the process of bringing that offering, that sin offering, is slaughtering it. Now, at the time that it was slaughtered, and presumably a priest slaughters it, right, in the precincts of the Holy Temple. So either because there was a miscommunication, there was an error, some clerk made a mistake, the priest was having a busy day, wasn't listening, you made a mistake when you communicated to the priest, for whatever reason, we haven't decided, we haven't discussed yet what caused this error, but for whatever reason, at the time that goat was slaughtered, the priest was thinking that he was slaughtering it for a burnt offering, right? Which is the same as an elevation offering, that instead of certain pieces would be eaten by the Kohanim and it would achieve an atonement for a unwitting sin. Instead, he thought that he was bringing this goat as a burnt offering, which might be a Thanksgiving free will offering, or it might be a burnt offering that's part of a process of a Nazir finishing his Naziris. There's various situations where a burnt offering is brought, but he slaughtered it thinking it was a different kind of offering. Therefore, when it was slaughtered, it was not slaughtered for its own sake. The intention at the time of slaughter was not to slaughter a sin offering for you to achieve atonement through a sin offering. So then what happens? So for most offerings, most situations where that situation happened, since it was a kosher animal that's fit to be brought, as a sin offering or as a burnt offering, it was just slaughtered with the wrong intention in mind. So it remains fit to be brought as an offering. And so they're going to finish the process. And since it was supposed to be brought as a sin offering, the process will be finished as a sin offering. But because the slaughter was done not for its own sake, the person who brought that goat for a sin offering will not have achieved atonement. He'll have to bring another sin offering. That's why, communication and proper care and all those things were really important because now you have to bring another animal. But in the case of some offerings, when you slaughter with the improper intent, it renders the animal unfit. They cannot finish the sacrificial process. They won't bring it to the altar, cut it up, put its pieces on the altar to be consumed by the altar fire, blood sprinkled on the corners of the altar. If it was a sin offering, certain pieces given to the Kohanim to eat it. None of that will happen because if, for example, it was a Pesach, a Passover offering, and it was slaughtered as a burnt offering or Thanksgiving offering or a guilt offering or a sin offering, doesn't matter. If it was brought as a Pesach and then it wasn't slaughtered as a Pesach, it's rendered unfit. Stop the presses, right? They don't finish the process. And for sure, the owner has not brought his Pesach offering, which probably now he can't do. It'll be too late. Maybe he's going to come back Pesach Sheni, but he can't complete that process. That's the general principle. That's the general topic that we're talking about. And then at the end of yesterday, the question was, well, what if at the time that the priest slaughtered it, he expressed or had no intent? It's not that it was a sin offering and he thought or expressed verbally the intent that this is being brought as a burnt offering. It wasn't an error like that, but he expressed no intent. He just slaughtered. Right? So does an offering brought with no express intent count as one that was offered for its own sake or not offered for its own sake? And in order to answer that question, we've been talking about, analogous areas of the law that don't seem so analogous on their face until we think about it. And that's going to continue today, especially we're looking at the law of a get, of a bill of divorce. Right, so when a husband wants to divorce his wife under Jewish law, Jewish husband, Jewish wife, married under the laws of Torah in Israel, so for him to divorce his wife, when he writes the get, it has to be written for her, specifically for her. They're not yet divorced, but until he gives it to her, right? Then they would be divorced. Now, in that case, if he writes a bill of divorce for another woman who happens to have the same name as his wife, he can't then take that bill of divorce, which would be accurate if he gave it to his wife, since the same names are included in it. It was a different husband, and the husband and wife had the same names, or this man has two wives, and they both have the same exact names. But he wrote the bill of divorce for one of them, and then he decided to give it to the other. That's not a valid bill of divorce. So that we can say that the writing is analogous to the slaughter, and the giving would be analogous to the rest of the sacrificial process. So what if at the time that he wrote, he had no one in mind, and then he just gave it to his wife? Not valid. Right? So that would seem to indicate, since he had no specific intent at the time of writing the bill of divorce, then when he tried to give it to her, it's not a valid get. He'd have to go through this process again and make sure that he had intent to write a bill of divorce for his wife and then give it to her. So do we learn out from that one who slaughters with no specific intent of what kind of offering it's going to be brought, therefore would be rendered invalid? No, because the law of get is different than the law of bringing a sacrifice, where having no intent will not disqualify it, whereas for sacrifices, but for a get, if you had no intent, it would disqualify it. Okay, we're going to look at other kinds of related areas and see if we can apply their principles to this sacrificial process. Okay. Bottom of 2b, the Gemara asks, and with regard to a get, from where do we derive that if it was written without specification as to which woman it is referring, that it is not a valid get? So how do we know this? If we say it is inferred from that which we learned in a Mishnah in Tractate Gittin, which is the law of the tractate about divorces, in the case of a man who was passing through the marketplace, and he heard scribes who write gets dictating to their students, the man so-and-so divorces so-and-so from the place of such and such. And the man said, wow, this is my name and that is the name of my wife. And he desires to use this get. This get is unfit to divorce his wife with it. But that is not a proof that it won't work. That is not the proof that we need that why it doesn't work. Right? This doesn't prove that a guy who writes a get, that he writes it without intent of which wife he's going to give it to, he can't fill in that name later. Why is that not a proof? Because here he didn't write it, right? He just happened to be walking by the marketplace and somebody is teaching his students how to write a get, and it just turns out that the names he used as an example were the same names of this guy and his wife, and he's been thinking, I need to divorce my wife. Oh wow, I can save some money. I don't have to pay a scribe to write the get. These guys are just using my name and her name as a teaching example. So maybe I could just give him a couple bucks and he'll give me that get. And I won't have to pay, $100 or $1,000 to have a proper get written up. Doesn't work because at the time that it was written, it wasn't written with him and his wife in mind. But that doesn't prove that writing without specification makes it invalid. Why? It can be explained. Perhaps the Mishnah is in accordance with the explanation of Rav Papa. As Rav Papa says, here we are dealing with scribes who are wont to practice writing gets, and this get is a draft, and it was not written for the sake of anybody's divorce, right? It was just written for the practice of writing gets at all. But if a get is written to be used for a divorce, perhaps it is fit, even if it was written without specifying the woman in question. So rather, we derive this law that a get written without specification is not a valid get from the subsequent clause in that Mishnah. Now we're at the top of 3a. So moreover, if a husband wrote a get with which to divorce his wife, but later reconsidered, and a resident of his town found him and said to him, hey, my name is the same as your name, and my wife's name is the same as your wife's name, and we reside in the same town, so give me that get that you've decided not to use, and I'll use it. But in this case, the get is unfit for the second man to divorce his wife with it. So evidently, if the get was written to be used for divorce, but it was not written for the person who ultimately used it, it is not valid. And the Gemara responds, yes, but perhaps there it is different, as the get was specifically designated for the sake of the first man's divorce. And that's why it's not valid for the second man's divorce. But have we established that a get written for nobody's divorce, in particular, could later be applied to somebody's divorce? It was written with no specific intent, right? But a get that was written without specification might still be valid if it was written for the sake of divorce, but just wasn't specified at the time of writing. So how do we know that such a get doesn't work? We haven't proved that yet. How do we know? So rather, derive it from the subsequent clause in that Mishnah. Moreover, if he has two wives whose names are identical, and he wrote a get to divorce the older one, and then he reconsidered, but he may not divorce the younger one with it. So evidently, a get must be written specifically to divorce a specific wife. But have we proved that a get that wasn't written with any specification in mind is not valid? We haven't proved that yet because he had a particular woman in mind. He changed his mind and then tried to use that get for a different woman. That we know doesn't work, but that doesn't prove that a get written without specification is not valid, right? The Gemara says perhaps there it is different, as the get was specifically designated for the sake of the divorce to the older wife. And that's why it can't be used for the second younger wife. So rather, derive it from the subsequent clause in that Mishnah. Moreover, if he said to the scribe, write a get for one of my two wives who have identical names, and I will use it to divorce whichever one of them I want to divorce, then this get is unfit to divorce either wife with it. So evidently, it must be written for the divorce of a specific woman. Does this prove that a get written without any specification at all is also unfit? The Gemara responds, well, perhaps there it is different, as there is no retroactive designation. The designation of the get cannot be determined retroactively. Since he has two wives with the same name, and he said to the scribe, well, just write it with that name, and I'll decide later which wife I want to divorce with it. That means that at the time he wrote it, he didn't have a specification. but there were two names in it, and then later he decides, so that it would actually be making retroactive designation. What he's saying is, okay, at the time that it was written, I meant this one, or I meant that one, retroactively designating it at the time of the writing. But it may be that retroactive designation doesn't work in the realm of gittin, and that's why that would not be a valid get. But we still haven't proven that a get that was written with no specification can't later become specified. Rather, to derive that a get written without any specification cannot become specified later, derive it from the Mishnah in Tractate Gittin on page 26a, where it says, with regard to a scribe who writes that standard part of gets in advance, so that when one requests a get, he will have to add only the details unique to that case. He must leave empty the place of the name of the man and the place of the name of the woman and the place of the names of the witnesses and the place of the date. And in addition, Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says a scribe must also leave the place of the essential phrase, you are hereby permitted to marry any man. That's the active phrase, which means you're no longer married to me. You are permitted to marry any man, since it must be written for the sake of that specific woman. So evidently, a get must be written for a specific husband, a specific wife, and if not, it is not valid, even if it was written for the sake of divorce, not as a teaching example. The fact that it didn't have those specifics at the time that it was written, it's not a valid get. Now, Ravina continued to inform Rav Papa of Rava's statements. Rava further raises another contradiction. Did Rav Yehuda say that Rav says that a sin offering that one slaughtered for the sake of a burnt offering is unfit, whereas if one slaughtered the animal for the sake of consumption of non-sacred meat, it is fit? Right? So this is very interesting. Now what we're saying is, okay, if you were bringing a sin offering, and at the time of slaughtering it, you told the priest you made a mistake, or the priest heard you wrong, or for whatever reason, an error was made, and when it was slaughtered as a burnt offering. So we've said that in that situation, I think that what we've actually said is that it is fit, but it will not fulfill the obligation of the one who's bringing it. But it might be that according to Rav Yehuda, right, minority view, it is unfit, right? If it's unfit, that means you don't even finish the sacrificial process with it, okay? That's if you confused a sin offering with a burnt offering. But what if, when you slaughtered the sin offering, you forgot that that animal was going to be brought as an offering at all? You just confused your animal that was going to be brought as a sin offering with another one of your animals that you were just going to use for the barbecue on Sunday. And so you slaughtered the sin offering animal for the sake of non-sacred meat, right? Just to eat it at the barbecue. So, and then at the time of slaughter, and then once it was slaughtered, you're like, oh no, that wasn't the barbecue lamb. That was the sin offering lamb. So it was slaughtered for the wrong purpose. But now, instead of getting, confusing one kind of offering with another kind of offering, you've confused a sin offering with just dinner, right? Like a non-sacred situation, non-sacred context, just eating it, right? It was going to be slaughtered just for the sake of eating it. So does that produce a different result, is the question. And what's interesting about this is it might produce a different result. And the reason is because the error that you made was so far afield that it wasn't confusing one kind of offering with another kind of offering. It was just like a total mistake, so much so that it's going to end up with a less severe consequence because, from a policy consideration, this is such an unusual mistake that we don't have to, make laws because of it. And it's not going to come to confuse people in the future. and it's a less dangerous type of error, right? Because it's not going to lead to sloppiness. This is just a really like whoa out of left field type of mistake, which actually has less consequences. Let's read. Right? So did Rav Yehuda say that Rav says that a sin offering that one slaughtered for the sake of a burnt offering is unfit, whereas if one slaughtered the animal for the sake of consumption of non-sacred meat, it would remain fit, meaning you could finish the process of bringing it as a sin offering, even though it would not bring atonement for the one who needed to bring a sin offering. So apparently, only improper intent that is of its type, i.e., for the sake of another offering, ruins the offering and renders it unfit. Whereas wrong intent that is not of its type, i.e., for the sake of consumption of non-sacred meat, something totally different, is disregarded and does not ruin it. Again, it doesn't fulfill his obligation to bring a sin offering, but it doesn't render it unfit to have the process finished of bringing a sin offering. And Rava raises a contradiction from the aforementioned Mishnah in Tractate Gittin on page 24a. Any get that was written not for the sake of the woman who is being divorced with it is not valid, and by inference, even if it was written for the sake of a Gentile woman, it is not valid. With regard to the matter of a divorce, a Gentile woman is not of the same type as a Jewish woman, as the laws of Gittin are irrelevant to her. Right? When a non-Jewish couple decides to get a divorce, they don't write a get, right? They have totally different laws. So if there was a confusion at the time of writing the get and somebody inserted the name of a non-Jewish woman, that would be not akin to writing it for the wrong woman. That would be akin to having no intent at all at the time that it was written, because Gentile women are outside the laws of Jewish divorce. And Rava resolves the contradiction. If a get is written for the sake of a Gentile woman, it is not valid, because if you remove the intent for the sake of the Gentile woman from it, it is considered simply to be a get without specification of the woman who is divorced with it. And a get without specification is not valid. But if sacrificial animals are slaughtered for the sake of consumption of non-sacred meat, they remain fit. Since if you remove the non-sacred intent from them, they are considered to be without specification. And offerings slaughtered without specification are fit. A get has to be written for a particular woman, and then to complete the divorce given to that woman. A sacrifice, if it's slaughtered for the sake of the wrong type of offering, it will not fulfill an obligation. It may or may not remain fit. If it is slaughtered without any intent at all, then nothing happened, right? It can move forward. It can be brought as a sin offering, for example, and then the owner of it will have achieved atonement, because the fact that there was no intent at all at the time of the slaughtering, we would go backwards in time and say, well, what was the presumptive status of that slaughter? I mean, he designated that animal to bring it as a sin offering. He brought the animal to the Holy Temple so that he could make a sin offering, and then it was slaughtered at the Holy Temple so that it could be brought as a sin offering. The priest expressed no intent. This guy expressed no intent, but it maintains its presumptive status of being slaughtered for a sin offering. And Rav raised another contradiction. Did Rav Yehuda say that Rav says that a sin offering that one slaughtered for the sake of a burnt offering is unfit, whereas if one slaughtered it for the sake of consumption of non-sacred meat, it is fit? So apparently he holds that only improper intent that is of its own type ruins it, whereas wrong intent that is not of its type does not ruin it. Okay, that's what we just said a minute ago, but now we're going to analyze it differently. But isn't it taught in a baraisa, the Torah states with regard to ritually impure carcasses of creeping animals, a sheretz. Okay, so what's a sheretz? It's this list in the Torah of 8 animals, and we don't have a definitive tradition on what those 8 animals are. Most agree, a mouse, I think a rat, a chameleon, a skink, just certain small creeping things that include, mice and some kinds of lizards that if such an animal was dead and it fell on something that was tahor, ritually pure, it would impart tuma. It would render, that pile of produce, or at least the produce that came into contact with that dead creeping thing, tameh, ritually impure. If a sheretz fell into an earthenware vessel, even if it didn't touch the sides of the earthenware vessel, but it was in the airspace of the earthenware vessel, that earthenware vessel would be rendered tameh, right? So if then teruma was poured into it, right, the portion of the produce that's consecrated to be given to a priest, and a priest can only eat it when the priest is tahor, ritually pure, and this product that was tithed for the sake of the priest, that's called teruma. The first 2% is given to a priest. Both the teruma and the priest have to be in a state of ritual purity. If either one of them came into contact with a sheretz, they would become tameh, and then the priest would have to become purified before he could eat the teruma. Or if the teruma became tameh, it would be rendered unfit, and the priest could never eat it. Okay, so that's what a sheretz will do. Now let's see, why is that relevant to the law of a sacrifice that was slaughtered without specification? Okay, the Torah states with regard to sheretzim, right, the ritually impure carcasses of creeping animals, quote, and every earthen vessel into whose interior any of them falls, anything that is in its interior shall be tameh, ritually impure. Leviticus 11:33. Again, this has nothing to do with bacteria or, disease or plague or bubonic or nothing like that. We're talking about ritual purity and ritual impurity. It's something that is not evident. You could never, do some kind of DNA test. There's no scientific evidence. It requires vigilance. You have to make sure that it never came into contact with the sheretz so that you can be confident that it still is tahor. Other sources of tuma, of ritual impurity, would be a dead human, or a woman who is menstruating, or a man who's had a seminal emission, or something that came into contact with one of those sources of impurity under certain conditions. Okay. Or a mitzora, right? Somebody who's having tsaras, that skin eruption that was a physical expression of a spiritual malady. Okay, let's keep going. Now here we're talking about a sheretz that falls into an earthenware vessel and renders everything inside the earthenware vessel tameh. Now remember, most Jews can eat food that is tameh. We don't have to eat food that is tahor unless we're a chaver, that's trying to keep himself up, live by a much higher standard. But the average Jew who's not a priest can absolutely eat food that is tameh unless there's some other reason that he can't. Now, from the word interior, it is derived that only food in its interior is rendered impure, but not any food that is in the interior of its interior, i.e. in another vessel within the earthenware vessel. Right? The inner vessel would shield its own contents from the tuma that is around it if there's an earthenware vessel within an earthenware vessel. And this is the law, not only if the inner vessel is an earthenware vessel, even if it is a metal or wooden vessel, and those kinds of vessels can be purified through rinsing, whereas an earthenware vessel that becomes tameh cannot be purified. It can only be destroyed. But a wood vessel or a metal vessel, if it became tameh, or came into contact for that matter with non-kosher food, which is not ritual impurity, it just would become unkosher. But those could be koshered, or they could be purified by immersing them in a mikvah, depending on the source of tuma or what it came into contact with. It might require boiling water, or it might require passing through a fire, but it could be purified. Earthenware vessels cannot be purified. So if you had a metal vessel within the earthenware vessel, or a wooden vessel within the earthenware vessel, a sheretz fell into it. So food that was in the larger earthenware vessel would all become tameh. But food that was in the inner vessel that is sealed, even though it's inside an earthenware vessel, it would not become impure because its own vessel shielded it. And Rava resolves, so wait a minute. And this is the law, not only the inner vessel is an earthenware vessel, even if it is a metal or wooden vessel, which is purified through rinsing in a mikveh, and is therefore susceptible to impurity from its exterior, it nevertheless protects food that is inside it from being rendered impure. So evidently, even a vessel that is not of the same type, that's why we're talking about type, right? So an inner vessel within an outer vessel doesn't have to be an earthenware inner vessel in order to protect from tuma of the sheretz that fell into the larger vessel. Therefore, evidently, even a vessel that is not of the same type serves to nullify the status of the interior of an earthenware vessel in terms of protecting its own contents. So what we're getting at is, does it have to be the same type in order to produce the larger consequence? It would seem that here, it doesn't have to be the same type, and yet it can protect. Let's keep reading. And Rava resolves the contradiction as follows. A vessel purified through rinsing is actually considered of the same type as an earthenware vessel, since they are both vessels. Concerning the laws of impurity, the equivalent of intent with regard to the consumption of non-sacred meat, right, where you slaughtered it not for another offering, but just for a totally different purpose of consumption of non-sacred meat, to make an analogy to that in this realm of the law of rendering things impure, concerning the laws of impurity, the equivalent of intent with regard to the consumption of non-sacred meat is an item that is not a vessel at all. So the sages rendered non-sacred meat with regard to sacrificial animals like a partition with regard to an earthenware oven. So how does this analogy work? Just as a partition in an oven is not effective at all in preventing the transmission of impurity from one side to the other, since the partition is not a vessel, so too, slaughtering an offering for the consumption of non-sacred meat is not effective at all with regard to rendering sacrificial animals unfit. In other words, it doesn't render them unfit, it leaves them fit. And we learn that out. Similarly, it's tough to follow the analogy, but the point is if a sheretz falls into a large earthenware vessel, if there's an inner vessel that has some food within it, that food within the inner vessel will not be rendered tameh by the sheretz that's in the larger vessel around it. However, if you had a partition in that earthenware vessel, and there was food on one side of the partition and the sheretz fell on the other, all of the food inside that earthenware vessel will be rendered unfit. The partition doesn't do anything because partition doesn't stop tuma from spreading from one side of an earthenware vessel to another. Only an inner vessel would do that. And this is, as we learned in a Mishnah in Tractate Kalim, in the case of an oven that one divided with boards or with curtains, and the carcass of a creeping animal, a sheretz, was found in one place, all of the food in the oven, including that on the other side of the partition, is tameh. The Mishnah continues, in the case of a round barrel that is broken and plugged up with straw and lowered into the airspace of the oven, if the sheretz is inside the barrel, the oven is rendered tameh. And if the sheretz is in the oven, the food that is inside the barrel is rendered tameh, right? Because this barrel plugged with straw is not considered a vessel at all. It's a broken vessel, which is to say not a vessel. The broken barrel is not considered a vessel despite it being plugged up with straw, and therefore it does not prevent the transmission of tuma between the sheretz and everything in the oven. And Rabbi Eliezer deems the food in the barrel pure. Presumably Rabbi Eliezer would say, well, a barrel plugged with straw is a vessel, even though it's a very inadequate vessel. So the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Eliezer said, my opinion can be inferred kal v'chomer, in a fortiori inference. If a barrel or any other partition between some item and a corpse under the same roof protects the item from becoming tameh, even though tuma imparted by a corpse is severe in that it lasts 7 days, shouldn't a partition protect food in the airspace of an earthenware vessel from tuma imparted by the sheretz, which is mild by comparison? A sheretz, if you come into contact with it, you'll only be tameh for 1 day. If you come into contact with a human corpse, you'll be tameh for 7 days. So if being inside a tent or under a roof with a corpse, but there's a wall between you and the corpse, that's going to not mean that you will not become tameh. Then why shouldn't this barrel inside an earthenware vessel also protect its contents, according to Rabbi Eliezer? And the Mishnah continues, well, the rabbis said to Rabbi Eliezer, right, the majority who were overruling him, your inference is not correct. If a partition protects an item from tumah imparted by a corpse, which is severe, this is only because such impurity is unique, in that it is imparted to that which is in the same tent, i.e. under the same roof. And tents are divided by partitions. So if so, should a partition protect food from an impurity imparted in an earthenware vessel, which, although mild, is not divided by partitions like tents are? Right? Partitions belong in tents. They have partitions. It's of the same type, as it were. Whereas ovens don't have wooden partitions in them for obvious reasons. That's why it would not protect. Now we're on page 3b. And the Gemara notes a comparison between non-sacred meat vis-a-vis offerings and a partition in an earthenware vessel works out well according to the opinion of the rabbis, who hold that a partition does not prevent transmission of tumah inside an earthenware vessel. But if we stick with the minority opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who maintains that a partition is effective in an earthenware oven, then what can be said? How is this comparable, or how is this compatible with the principle that an item is not affected by something that is not of its type? And the Gemara responds, well, Rabbi Eliezer agrees with this principle, yet he says that a partition in an earthenware vessel is effective due to his kal v'chomer inference, which overrides the principle that an item is not affected by something not of its type. Whereas the rabbis who disagree with him do not use the kal v'chomer inference to override the principle that something is only affected by something of its type and not something that is not of its type. The Gemara challenges this. If that is so, that a kal v'chomer inference overrides this principle for Rabbi Eliezer, let us say a kal v'chomer inference there as well, with regard to a sin offering that was slaughtered for the consumption of non-sacred meat. If slaughtering sacrificial animals for the sake of other sacrificial animals desecrates those sacrificial animals, all the more so is it not clear that slaughtering them for the consumption of non-sacred meat desecrates them? Why can't we use a kal v'chomer there? And the Gemara responds, rather, the reason behind this statement of Rav that a sin offering slaughtered for the consumption of non-sacred meat is fit is not in accordance with this principle at all, but it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar. Not Eliezer, but Elazar. As Rabbi Elazar says, what is the reasoning of Rav? What is the reasoning behind this statement of Rav? The verse, quote, and they shall not desecrate the sacred items of the children of Israel, which they set apart unto the Lord, in Leviticus 22:15. This teaches that only improper intentions for the sake of sacred items, i.e. offerings, desecrate the sacred items and render them unfit, but a non-sacred intent does not desecrate sacred items. Again, that's why if you slaughtered what was supposed to be a sin offering for the sake of a burnt offering, according to this view, you would render it unfit. But if you slaughtered what was supposed to be a sin offering for the sake of something non-sacred at all, that would not render it unfit, because it's something not of its type. It's so far afield that it will not detract from its sanctity. The Gemara notes, so apparently an inference from a verse can come to rule out a conflicting kal v'chomer inference. Well, if so, here too, with regard to a partition in an oven, let the verse and every earthenware vessel into whose interior any item falls come to rule out Rabbi Eliezer's kal v'chomer inference that a partition prevents food in an earthenware oven from becoming tameh. And the Gemara responds to this challenge by saying, this expression, whose interior, does not indicate that a partition is ineffective, as it is necessary to teach another law, namely, that food that one kneaded with clay, kneading like kneading dough, covering it from all sides, and put it in the airspace of an oven that had a sheretz in it, is impure. Right? In other words, we said that if there's an earthenware vessel, a small one, inside a larger earthenware oven, what's inside the smaller vessel, which is sealed, does not become tameh if a sheretz falls into the larger space of the earthenware vessel. Here they're saying, okay, well, let's say that the earthenware vessel, the small one, the way you made it was you took you made a ball, you took some bread dough, right? And instead of baking it, you just wrapped it in clay. And then you put that in the oven. Okay, so both the bread is going to bake and the clay is going to harden. So was the bread that was inside this soft clay that was surrounding it, will we say that this is like bread was inside an earthenware vessel at the time that the sheretz fell in? This expression, whose interior, does not indicate that a partition is ineffective, because it was necessary to teach a different law, namely that food that one surrounded with clay, covering it on all sides, and put it in the airspace of an oven that had the carcass of a creeping animal in it, is impure, right, before the clay was baked. Because it might enter your mind to say that since the food cannot become impure by touching an impure item, as the clay serves as an interposition, it also cannot become impure by being put in the airspace of an impure oven. The phrase, in whose interior any of them falls, teaches us that the food does contract impurity because being surrounded by clay is not the same as being inside an earthenware vessel. And the Gemara asks, and as for the rabbis who apparently do interpret the verses teaching that a partition is ineffective in preventing the contracting of tuma in an earthenware vessel, how do they derive that food covered with clay and placed in an impure oven is impure? And the Gemara answers, these matters do not need a verse to teach them. Such food has the same status as any other food in an impure oven, and the law, therefore, is self-evident. It was surrounded by clay. It was not in an earthenware vessel. New topic. Rav Yosef Bar Ami raised a contradiction between Rav's statement with regard to deviation with regard to the type of offering, i.e. slaughtering for the sake of a different type of offering. You meant to bring a sin offering. At the time it was slaughtered thinking it was a burnt offering, right? Wrong type of offering. And Rav's statement with regard to deviation with regard to the owner. When the priest slaughtered it, he knew it was a sin offering, but he thought he was slaughtering this sheep to be a sin offering for Sal, when in fact, Bill brought it, right? It was Bill's sin offering. And so when the priest slaughtered it, thinking it was Sal's sin offering, now it was slaughtered for the correct type of offering, but for the wrong owner. What happens then? Is it rendered unfit? And can Bill still finish the process and obtain his atonement through that offering? Let's see. So the contradiction is as follows. Did Rav say that a sin offering that one slaughtered for the sake of another sin offering, i.e. one that the owner is obligated to bring for a different transgression, is fit, but that if one slaughtered for the sake of a burnt offering, it is unfit? So apparently slaughtering an offering with an improper intention not of its type ruins it, whereas intent that is of its type does not ruin it. What? That's not what we said before. But doesn't Rav say that a sin offering that one slaughtered for a person who is not its owner, but who nevertheless is obligated to bring a sin offering, is unfit? Whereas if one slaughtered for a person who is obligated to bring a sin offering, a burnt offering, it is fit? So apparently improper intention that is of its type ruins the offering, whereas intent not of its type does not ruin it. But now we're defining type more tightly, so to speak. And he resolves the contradiction as follows. There, with regard to deviation from the type of offering, a sin offering slaughtered as a burnt offering, the merciful one states in the Torah, and slaughter it for a sin offering. And here a sin offering was slaughtered for the sake of a sin offering. And therefore, although it was for the sake of a different sin offering, right, a different owner, or even the same owner, but a different sin that he committed, it remains fit. Does he achieve atonement with it? Probably not. But it can continue its journey to the altar and to have its parts eaten by the priests. Here, concerning deviation with regard to the owner, it is written in the Torah concerning a sin offering, and he shall be forgiven, indicating that specifically he, the owner, but not another person, shall be forgiven. Therefore, if a sin offering is slaughtered for the sake of another person, it is unfit, well, meaning it will not achieve atonement, but do we finish the process? The other person to whom this is referring is presumably similar to him, the owner of a sin offering, in that he is obligated to make atonement similar to that of the owner. Therefore, if the other person is obligated to bring a burnt offering and not a sin offering, this disqualification would not apply. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in now. Rav Chaviva raised a contradiction between Rav's statement concerning deviation with regard to the owner and the aforementioned Baraisa concerning the interior of its interior, i.e. a vessel placed in an earthenware vessel, and he resolves the contradiction. The contradiction is as follows. But did Rav say that a sin offering that one slaughtered for a person other than its owner, but who is obligated to bring a sin offering, is unfit? Whereas if one slaughtered it for a person who was obligated to bring a burnt offering, it would be fit? So apparently an improper intention that is of its type ruins it, whereas intent that is not of its type does not ruin it. Now we're defining type more narrowly, not just a totally different sin offering, but a different owner, but who has a different obligation, or has the same obligation. But isn't it taught in a Baraisa that if a sheretz is found inside an earthenware vessel, the vessel's interior is rendered tameh, ritually impure, but not the interior of its interior, what's inside the smaller earthenware vessel inside the larger one? And even if it was not an earthenware vessel inside, but one that can be purified through rinsing, i.e. a metal container or a wood container, it would protect the food inside it from contracting tumah. And from that, we say, evidently, impurity in the airspace of an earthenware vessel can be contained by something not of its type. And Rav Chaviva resolves the contradiction as follows. The expression, whose interior, is written 4 times. In other words, in the verse. And every earthenware vessel into whose interior any of them falls, anything that is in its interior shall be impure. This is interior, the word is tocha. So the word tocha is mentioned twice, and each time the verse could have written the interior, instead of its interior. Since the possessive its interior is added to each instance, the verse is interpreted exegetically as though the word interior, toch, were mentioned 4 times. Toch, tocha, toch, tocha. One of these is necessary to teach the matter itself, that an impure earthenware vessel imparts impurity to food in its airspace. And one instance is used for a verbal analogy between 2 instances of the word interior, from which it is derived that an earthenware vessel itself contracts impurity from impure items in its airspace, not just its contents, but the earthenware vessel itself. The third instance of this word indicates that the interior airspace of this earthenware vessel renders any food in it impure, even if it wasn't touching the earthenware vessel itself, but not the interior of another type of vessel, like a smaller vessel inside, which imparts impurity only through contact. And the fourth instance indicates that its interior, but not the interior of its interior, imparts pure impurity. And that even a vessel purified through rinsing, if placed in the earthenware vessel, protects food inside it from becoming impure. So, consequently, it is derived from a verse that inside an earthenware vessel, other vessels not of its type can block the transmission of impurity. And since this law is derived from a verse written in that context, through some delving, there is no reason to assume that a similar halacha would apply to slaughter, right? We were trying to learn out type versus not of its type, a law that we learn in the protecting from tumah within an earthenware vessel. Can we extend that principle to an animal that was slaughtered, first as just a totally different offering, then slaughtered for a different person, but who was obligated to bring the sin offering, the same offering, or versus slaughter for a wrong person, and that wrong person was obligated to bring an offering, but a different offering. Can we extend the laws of type from the area of tuma in earthenware vessels to the area of offerings at the time of their slaughter with the wrong intent? Maybe yes, maybe no. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let's take some questions. This is not easy material, right? It's not so much about the spiritual content of are we affecting atonement or not through this offering, but rather analysis of did we fulfill our obligation or not when different kinds of errors were made. Okay. Let me reload my questions document so that I can see if Nina is passing over some questions to me. Yes, she is. Sharon, I did not think wooden vessels could be purified as they are porous. But I guess they can, right? I guess they can. Which is interesting, right? Because they can absorb flavors. But are we talking about koshering, or are we talking about rendering them tahor after they've been made tameh? Those areas of the law are similar, possibly related, but not the same. Not the same. Bill, so if a closed earthenware Dutch oven, which is an inner vessel, was inside an earthenware oven in which a creeping thing died, is the Dutch oven pure? Perfect question. As I was reading that last section, I realized I might have misunderstood a little, right? The contents of the inner earthenware vessel are protected. And metal vessel that a creeping thing touched its outside, right, becomes impure, and if it becomes impure, its contents can become impure, right? Here we said, nevertheless, even a metal inner vessel that didn't come into contact directly with the sheretz, it will protect its contents from becoming impure. But what you're asking is, okay, well, if the inner oven, the inner earthenware vessel, it protected its contents, but did it itself become tameh? And if not, would it make a difference if the sheretz touched the outside of the inner vessel directly, not just it was contained in a large earthenware vessel that sheretz fell into? It sounds like this is a distinction between earthenware vessels. It's almost like an unexpected, counterintuitive contradiction. Earthenware vessels can't be purified if they become tameh. They have to be destroyed. But they don't become tameh as easily as the kind of vessels that you can purify. So I think maybe contact with the outside of an earthenware vessel doesn't render the whole vessel and its contents impure. But that's not really the area of the law that we're studying now. We're talking about offerings being slaughtered in the temple, and we are analyzing whether this principle from over there can be extended over here, and we're not doing a deep dive on which vessels become tameh and how they become tameh. So it's a good question, and I'm not prepared to answer it. Sharon, was bread ever actually made surrounded by clay? I'm guessing no. Sounds to me like hypothetical question. Joseph, assuming a rabbi or priest is overseeing a get, how would it come about that a get would be written without intent or one of these other kinds of incidents? A priest really has nothing to do with it, right? But when you say a rabbi, what you really mean is like a judge or a scribe, somebody who is, familiar with the law of a get, that this guy, this husband, is consulting with him to make sure it gets done properly. Well, what if he, didn't consult with them? So a husband can write a get. He doesn't have to have a scribe write it for him. He doesn't have to have the counsel and supervision of a judge at the time that he's writing a get. If he feels that he's familiar enough with the law, he could just write the get. And then if he wrote it properly and gave it to his wife, they'd be divorced. But when people take the law into their own hands, they often make mistakes. And that's how you could end up in one of these situations. Lucy, does everyone who eats tameh food need purification afterwards? Or can non-priests? And then your question got cut off. But no, that's the point. I think maybe you asked that before because I think I mentioned it earlier in the class. You don't have to eat food that is tahor. Absolutely not. Chulin, right? Just regular food, non-sacred food, doesn't have to be tahor in order for us to eat it. Only consecrated food, eaten for the sake of its consecration, meaning consecrated and given to a priest. So he has to be tahor, and the food has to be tahor for him to be able to eat that food. He owns that food. If it becomes tameh, he can sell it. I think he can and keep the proceeds, and then a non-priest can eat it, right? Or just food that became tameh, we can eat it if we're not priests. There were these people known as chaverim, right? These were the sages who took on as, and other people, just certain sects of Jews in ancient times who took it upon themselves to conduct themselves like priests. And therefore, they would only eat food that was tahor, and they were in a state of tahara when eating it. But that was above and beyond and not required by the Torah. And these days, right, we're all assumed to be tameh because we don't know where the bodies are buried, and we haven't had a red cow, a red heifer, in many, many centuries. And so, of course, we're eating in a state of tuma, and we're coming into contact with food all the time. So all the food is tameh, right? Priests can eat it too because it wasn't given to them as teruma. And finally, Michelle, wine barrels. I guess you're saying, is a wine barrel, which is a wooden vessel, would it be considered something that shields from tuma if there was a small wine barrel within a larger earthenware vessel? Sounds like, yeah, it would. It would shield its contents as long as it was sealed. That's the way that I'm reading it. I could be wrong, but that's the way I'm reading it. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday, regular Thursday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. And reminder that there will be no class Saturday night. No class this Saturday night, because as soon as Shabbos ends, I got to get myself about an hour away to do a Q&A after a special screening. That's what I've got for us today. God willing, see you tomorrow, Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific.